If you've been on YouTube for the past couple of months, you definitely would have seen these shorts. And those of you who are more experienced would be able to identify that these 3D animations are made using Blender. And those of you who are even more nerdy would be able to identify that these are soft bodies. Now, if this was a Blender tutorial channel, I'd probably be making a noob versus pro video on the most optimal way to add soft bodies. What nerds. But look at me. Do you think I have friends? Exactly, because this is a coding channel, which is why I'm going to be programming soft body physics from scratch. To get started, let's outline the goals of this video. First, we'll start by trying to understand how most games implement their soft body physics and try to replicate it using Python. Then we'll understand how games allow collisions between different soft bodies. This step is much harder than it seems, and I'll explain why later. And finally, I'll transfer the Python code to Rust using buggy and attempt to make a soft body Tetris game that's actually playable. So without further ado, let's try to understand the physics behind soft bodies. If you're trying to implement soft body physics without any research, you might be tempted to start off with a rectangle. And if this rectangle gets squished or stretched too far in any direction, it would apply a force so that it can return to its original shape. Now, this way of implementing soft bodies has many flaws, but it is a step in the right direction. To model these forces, you then might implement a check here to make sure that these edges aren't too close, and then maybe another check here to make sure that these edges aren't too close, and then finally a check here to make sure that these corner points aren't too close. And before you realize it, we've actually derived how most soft body systems work. The checks here that we've implemented can be thought of as springs, and together these springs help maintain the shape of the rectangle. The nice thing about springs is that we can actually model any shape with them. Using different arrangements and quantities of springs, we can make soft bodies whose resting shape looks like a triangle, a square, a pentagon, or even my channel icon. Whoa, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Firstly, we need to know how to model the forces of these springs. Thankfully, it's pretty simple. Some guy 400 years ago found out that the force applied to the spring is proportional to the length of the spring compared to its resting length. This sounds kind of complicated, but it just basically says that if the spring is 2 cm away, there will be a 2 cm force that pushes it in the opposite direction. In vector math, this isn't even that difficult either. We just get a relative direction between the 2 points and scale it based on this force. Then, we add this force to the velocity and we have a working simulation. Now, in his equation, there's also a k, which is basically the stiffness of the spring. So as you can see here, as k increases, so does the frequency at which the spring oscillates. Now, this doesn't look that cool by itself, but if we add a force like gravity and allow container collisions, all of a sudden the simulation looks a lot more interesting. Now, this is basically all that we need to simulate a soft body. So to simulate a more complicated shape, we would define all the points that make up the shape and then add springs between those points. Then we simulate all those springs which form the shape. Now, although this looks okay, you notice that the shape is really fluidy and kinda unstable. This is because our springs would oscillate forever, which really isn't that accurate to reality. So to fix this, we add a damping to our springs. This requires a bit of vector math, but the idea is actually really simple. Basically, we want a force in the opposite direction to how the points are moving relative to one another. So if the points are moving towards one another, we want a force that faces away from one another. And if the points are moving away from one another, we want a force that moves towards one another. Notice that I said force, not vector. The end vector would still be the one here, but now will be scaled based on this damping force. Now, the reason why the math looks scary is because we want to know how related their relative velocities are to this vector, hence the dot product. But if you understand the math behind it, it's all quite elegant. Now, before I run the simulation again, we add two more things, which is our damping coefficient, or basically how strong our damping force is, and the clamp here. The reason the clamp is here is because for higher stiffness coefficients and higher forces, due to the numerical imprecision, the simulation is pretty unstable. But with that, we essentially are done. It's kind of amazing how simple the code is to model such complex objects. Now, before I continue to add collisions between different soft bodies, you notice that if I hit the cubes really hard, it's pretty easy for them to find a stable arrangement like this, where the inside springs and the outside springs switch. For cubes, this isn't that big of a problem, but for other shapes like this extended triangle, it's concerningly easy for this to happen, because the more springs you have, the easier it is for the shape to find another stable arrangement. Gonki mentioned this in his soft body video, and in his video, he solved this with self-intersections between the points. And although this works for him, it might not be the most optimal solution in my case, since I don't really have that many points to work with. So instead, I tried another method, which is shape matching. I first got introduced to shape matching through this really great video about the physics of Jellycar, which covers how he implemented soft body physics in his game Jellycar Worlds, linked in the description. In his video, he mentions his solution to the problem, which I thought was quite interesting, so I decided to give it a go. The basic idea is that we cast a skeleton of what the default shape should look like, and this skeleton would act as another layer of springs that pull the points into their correct places. Now surprisingly, the way to derive this skeleton is actually really simple. All we have to do is get the center of the body, as well as average the angle of the points. Then we rotate and place the base shape relative to the center and get our skeleton. To get the center, we average the position of all our points. And to get the average angle, we average the angles formed between our new points and the points of the base shape relative to the center. Now, I won't get into the math behind this, but if you also have no life, this is what it looks like. And bam! Now we can just copy and paste the math of our springs, but get rid of the damping, and we get a working skeleton. Now, if we go back to our cube model, it doesn't really look like anything has changed, and that's because the cubes are generally quite stable. But if we try the extended triangle again, you can see how it's no longer as easy to make it collapse. And if we visualize the skeleton points, you can see how well they are able to preserve the original shape of the body, which is actually kind of impressive since this is all just from the average position and angle. Well, actually I take that back. Not all shapes work very well. So as you can see here, this T kind of unrealistically rotates and sometimes balances itself. And if I was a more nerdy CS major, I'd probably think of a way to fix it using dampening techniques, but I'm a game developer. So I'll just use the usual hack of telling people that this is a feature and not a bug. Also, I think it looks kind of funny. Anyways, that's enough yapping for the soft body physics. Let's try to now allow soft bodies to collide with each other. There are two main parts to this: collision detection and collision response. So for collision detection, we have two options. We can either do a separating axes test, or we can cheese it with a ray casting approach. Surprisingly, this is the only time where the solution with the word ray is actually easier than the other one. An SAT, no, not the test you Americans, although great, is really way too much for the budget of this video, which is $0 in my sanity. So instead, we'll do the ray casting approach. The idea of the approach is that if we have a point inside the polygon and cast a ray in any direction, if the number of times that the ray intersects with an edge is odd, it means that the point is inside the shape. Otherwise, the point is outside the shape. To make my life easier, we'll use a horizontal ray since this is the most efficient to compute. Most videos that discuss this topic ended here, but I spent a total of 10 hours just trying to debug the problems that this algorithm creates, so I'm going to force you to see how crappy this algorithm actually is. Firstly, this algorithm is incredibly imprecise. See this point in this square? It may seem obvious that the point is outside the shape, but if you zoom really closely and count the intersections, you'll notice that the ray barely hits the corner of the square, double counts this point, then hits the other edge of the square, giving us 3 intersections. Actually, why don't you just not double count this point? Firstly, that's not easy to implement because we have to keep track of the points that we intersect. And secondly, this just doesn't work due to edge cases like this. Well, maybe ignore the lines that are horizontal. Well, it turns out that there isn't a single horizontal line due to the vibration of the points within the system. Turns out I couldn't find any perfect solution to this problem. Fun fact, this video was supposed to be released before school starts again, but this stupid bug took 2 days to debug. The best solution that I found would be just to check the distance between these points, and if it's far enough, we can assume that this is a faulty intersection. However, this fix is the equivalent of punching a child to make him shut up. Like, yeah, it feels good for a while, but then you're just brewing more problems. Anyways, the second problem is that it doesn't even freaking work. If none of the points are inside the other shape, we wouldn't be able to detect any collision, and the program just moves on with its day. The Jellycar developer mentions this in his video, saying that it doesn't happen most of the time, so it's okay. Well, have you wondered why there are no triangles in Jellycar? Because it happens all the time with triangles. If you put 2 triangles in this arrangement, the points perfectly seam through one another because they don't have a collision frame where they're in the other triangle. Thanks, Euler, for making this algorithm. Wait, Euler didn't invent this? Wait, so who invented this? Oh, I have never heard of this guy before. Well, anyways, f you for making such an annoying algorithm. Okay, so moving on to collision response, this is surprisingly less buggy. All we have to do is find the closest edge to the point that's inside the shape. We can do this using this formula. Thanks ChatGPT. And then we resolve the collision by pushing the points of the edge and the other point apart by this distance to the edge. However, we bias how far they're pushed apart based on whether the point is closer to this point or this point. As for the actual force that's applied, I just use the same vector as the force to push them apart. Honestly, this isn't really that physically based, but I mean, it still looks about right, so I'm not going to change it. With this, our soft body physics should be why is that happening? Now, the problem's probably not what you think it is. You're thinking it's the collision detection, right? If you're not, you're either really stupid, really smart, or watched this video before. I mean, if it's the last one, like, why are you even here? You know what I'm going to say next. Go watch something else. Anyways, it's not the collision detection for once, but because this point is doing a collision check with this edge, when it should be doing a collision check with this edge. Now, I did my research and I couldn't find much information about this problem, and there's actually remarkably little information on how to do collisions with other soft bodies online, so I tried a few solutions that I thought of myself. The most obvious solution is just to prevent the corners of the soft bodies from getting too close to each other. So what I did is just strap a ball to each corner, which prevents the points from other soft bodies from touching. And although this works fine, you quickly notice the artifact of the points kind of hooking onto each other. Now, I was going to live with this, but then sometimes the balls can push the point of the other soft bodies into the shape and break the collision that way. So I scrapped this idea and tried to think of something else. Next, I decided to consider edges whose normal is pointing towards the other shape. And the reason this works is because, believe it or not, collisions mainly happen when the other shape is outside the first shape. I know, you're welcome. What can I say as the smartest man alive? Now, the way I do this is by getting the normal of this edge, and then with the dot, we can get your nerdy ass out of here. We don't need an unemployed CS major lecturing us about math. Wait, what's that? You're actually interested. Okay, here's how it works, you nerd. Basically, we don't want this edge because the normal is not pointing towards the other shape. But we want this edge since the normal is somewhat pointing towards the other shape. Now, we don't actually have any point to compare where the other shape is, and we could use the center, which works well most of the time, but in shapes like this L, the center doesn't really describe our shape that well. So instead, we use a relative center that's formulated by taking the average of these four closest points. Then we get a vector that's pointing at this by subtracting the point by the closest point. Then, using the dot product, we can find out how related these two vectors are, and if it's lower than some threshold, we can be fairly certain that the edge is not pointing in our direction and discard it. Now, if we try the same cube test again, we notice that it's working a lot better now and that the point is colliding with this edge. Now we're finally done with the collision mechanics. However, as you can see, if I only add 10 soft bodies, my FPS drops quite a bit. Now, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. For every point in every soft body, we have to do calculations with every other edge of every other soft body more than 600 times a second if we want 10 simulation steps. Now, we can optimize this by doing a cheap bounding box intersection test to discard soft bodies that aren't near to us, but this only brings our FPS up by a little. Now, there might be a few more optimizations that we can make, but our main bottleneck here is actually the language. So with that, let's move on to the third part of this video, which is moving the entire simulation to Rust using bevy. Now, this should only take a couple of hours. After a couple days in my sanity, I was able to transfer the project to bevy. Now, I'm not going to go into how painful this was, but imagine stepping on Legos and stubbing your toe. Then imagine stubbing your toe on Legos. Yeah, it was really bad. Anyways, now you can see how much better it's running, and it's running with 100 simulation frames as well. So I guess the pain was worth it. Now, we should really move on to the soft body Tetris, but before that, let's have some fun with the simulation. Okay, so moving on, let's be the first person to make a playable soft body Tetris. What's that? Someone did it before me? You can't be serious. I mean, who would think of such an innovative and unique idea before? Well, crap. Well, actually, it's not that bad, because although newbie indie game dev, what a stupid name with 3 words in it, already made a soft body Tetris, I felt like the game was a bit too rigid and didn't feel as bouncy as soft bodies should be. Also, it had this annoying angle lock thing which kinda killed the feeling of the game. And I think this is all because he used Unity's built-in physics engine, which doesn't give him as much flexibility over the physics as a custom engine. Well, I mean, Unity's is also not as buggy as mine, but let's ignore that. So the basic idea behind soft body Tetris is that it's Tetris but with soft bodies. Well, yeah, but let's outline a few things our program must be able to do. Firstly, we need to detect line clears, and this seems trivial, but remember, all of our soft bodies are their own entities, so we have to somehow convert their rotations and positions into a grid that we can check for clears. Secondly, we need to be able to clear the lines. In normal Tetris, this is really easy, but since our engine is working with individual components, what we really want is to split up each soft body into new pieces which can be handled with the physics engine. Just thinking about this makes me giddy, so let's try the first step first. For line clears, we have to convert this section of soft bodies into a grid. Now, the way to do this seems pretty simple, but it has a few cases which we need to consider. Firstly, how would we add a diagonal piece like this into the grid? And secondly, what happens if a soft body is not perfectly aligned? To solve these problems, I decided that all soft bodies will display their closest 90-degree orientation into the grid. This sounds kinda confusing, but you can see the locking algorithm here and how the piece gets snapped into its closest 90-degree rotation. Now, if the piece is not perfectly rotated, it would feel a bit weird gameplay-wise to have this and this perform the same logic. So I made it so that soft bodies have to be rotationally aligned to a certain extent before being added to the grid. Or essentially, the program treats any soft body that isn't about 90 degrees as invisible. Now this actually sucks, because most of the time the soft bodies will fall on each other and form awkward angles, which make it difficult to clear lines. And in fact, this is a problem that the previous developer faced, which is why he locked their angles. However, this is where my custom physics engine comes into play. Because we have a skeleton, after a bit of resting time, we can snap the skeleton into its closest 90-degree angle and essentially force the piece to be rotationally oriented. This looks weird at first, but it makes the gameplay a lot more bearable, so I'm okay with it. As for the positional aligned piece issue, we can essentially do the same thing, but only add it to the grid if the piece is aligned enough. Okay, so now we have a grid of pieces, but I think I glossed over how we store this grid. The grid is essentially a large 2D array of booleans which can be flattened into a 1D array. Well, in reality, it's an array of numbers containing the IDs of the pieces, but just ignore that. The neat thing about an array of booleans is that we can represent the entire thing with a single number. Well, not the grid because it actually stores the IDs, but we can with the representation of the individual pieces. For example, this is what an L piece looks like. Okay, wait, let me represent this number in another way to make it look clearer. This is called a bitboard, and it can efficiently represent a shape that's in the 8x8 grid. I explained bitboards more thoroughly in this chess video, which I should really make a sequel to. I'm trying, okay? Just look at my commit history. But anyways, the reason I use bitboards is because we can perform bitboard logic on them, and here comes the magic. When doing a line clear, we can do some bit shifting to create a bitboard that looks like this, and end it with the piece bitboard to essentially clear this line from the piece. Pretty neat. Then after we have this bitboard of the cleared piece, we can perform an algorithm that I designed myself and is way more complicated than it needs to be to form a collection of vertices, connections, and triangles that I feed into my physics engine, as well as form a mesh that can be rendered. Then we delete the original piece from the engine and replace it with the new piece. I know what you're thinking. Why don't I just edit the existing piece to clear it? Well, ironically, that is way harder than this method because you have to find out the points that you're clearing, update the mesh that you're drawing, update the edges that are exposed, and a bunch of other things that I can't think about without dying internally. In fact, even the current method is really difficult, and I'm saving a bunch of details that took me hours to debug. In fact, I cheated a bit just to cut myself some work. Like, if the line clears a piece in the center and splits into 2 parts, I just take the bottom piece and ignore the top part, because that is way too much work. Again, it doesn't sound that bad, but one look at my pipeline and it'll literally give you a heart attack. But anyways, with that, we're essentially done with the main component of the game. After this, I just added some polish, like coloring the background a nice color, which is black, adding a line where you're forced to drop the piece, a scoreboard, some particles to hide the awful line clearing system, and of course an ending screen. Now, if you decide to play the game, which is linked in the description, just note that it's extremely buggy and sometimes may crash for a reason which I'm too lazy to look for. But after a while, I think you get used to the mechanics, and I think it's pretty fun to play. And I don't want to seem biased or anything, but I think we did make quite a nice improvement to the other soft body Tetris game. Now I'll end off this video with me absolutely crushing my own game while I drone on in the background. Firstly, I promise that my next video will be the chess sequel, which I have worked on, and this project was initially supposed to be a short break and released before the new year, but yeah, soft body physics is hard. But Chinese New Year is coming soon, so...
农历新年快乐!
Okay, I got this. Also, I went to my YouTube's analytics page to check out how many of you guys actually celebrate Chinese New Year, and wow, only 1% of my viewers are subscribed. I mean, I don't want to be that guy, but subscribing is free, it'll only take 1 second, and it helps move my channel. And secondly, I want to say thank you for helping me blow up this Rust video. Like, I mean, look at this distribution of views, damn. And with it, I somehow hit 1K subscribers before the end of the new year, which was absolutely insane. Like, thanks so much. Also, I want to address that yes, this video has a lot of errors which I should have double checked before posting it. And it was my first time learning a new language all by myself, and as you can see, I'm a idiot. So hopefully you can forgive me on that one. And lastly, I said that I would learn how to do a backflip if I hit 100 subscribers, so here's me doing it. Full face reveal at 100K. 3, 2, 1. Whoa, did you see that? That was crazy. Okay, but seriously, that was meant more of a joke, so I'll leave it up to you guys to decide what I should do in the comments. And I'll do the top comment as long as it seems reasonable to a certain extent. Like, don't ask me to program a Marvel Rivals jiggle physics mod. Like, come on guys, that's disgusting. But I mean, if you want me. But anyways, yeah, thanks for staying to the end, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Bye.